Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Christie's. Here we are before you, the wonderful array of objects that are on display for the forthcoming auction this Thursday, Art of the Islamic and Indian Worlds, including lots of Oriental rugs and carpets. And I hand you over to my colleague, Sarah. By the way, I'm Louise Broadhurst, head of the Oriental Carpet Department, for those of you who don't know me. And you are?
Thank you, I'm Sarah. All it remains for me to do really is to thank Katie Marsh, who is well known to every single one of you, I'm sure, and whose event, the event tonight is really completely her inspiration. And she's organised every element from the wonderful musicians you enjoyed earlier to the absolutely stellar lineup of speakers who we have coming up. And they're all here to celebrate, of course, the life and collecting of a truly wonderful man who, again, is familiar to every one of you here. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to someone who is very familiar in this particular area, William Robinson. Needs no introduction whatsoever. Yeah, over to you.
Good evening and welcome. How strange it is to be standing up here where in April I stood and said I was retiring. It was indeed true, and I've spent a very enjoyable intervening few months, but I'm here today to introduce the evening of eminent speakers from the academic and museum worlds who've come together to honor one of the great characters of the Islamic art field, and to speak briefly myself about Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah and his relationship with Christie's and the market. My brief introduction will be followed by vignettes about very different aspects of Sheikh Nasser, from Sue Strong of the Victoria and Albert Museum, Dr. Oliver Watson, also originally from the V&A and then director of the Museum of Islamic Art in Doha, by Professor Doris Behrens Abu Saif, formerly Nasser D. Khalili Chair of Islamic Art and Archaeology at SOAS and a prolific author in the field, Dr. Julian Raby, former director of the Freer Gallery of Art and the Arthur M. Sackler Gallery, now combined as the National Museum of Asian Art in Washington, D.C., still involved in numerous projects, and by Dr. Surem Malikian, scholar, exhibition organizer, author of numerous books and articles, and former International Herald Tribune arts correspondent. Our final speaker is Katie Marsh, a person who's been a linchpin of Sheikh Nasser's activities, artistic and otherwise, for many decades, and it's through Katie that this evening has been facilitated. Each individual presentation is short, with no introductions for the speakers individually beyond this, and the whole time is intended to last under an hour, which should give you time to enjoy the art surrounding us and to savor the hospitality provided with the very generous assistance of Sheikh Nasser's family, some of whom I'm delighted to welcome here. I first heard of Sheikh Nasser from my father, a little time before I joined Christie's. Here was a young man who'd come into the field of Islamic art, an Arab who was buying at the very highest level. He'd bought a painting that my father thought was probably his favorite image from the entire field. But this was, of course, just one of the many works of art that the young Sheikh Nasser was buying in the later 1970s. A few years ago, I met the heir from whom this painting was purchased. He still remembered vividly the appearance of this charming Arab client who arrived, introduced and accompanied by Oliver Hoare. And that painting was only one of a number of hugely important items that changed hands in that one purchase. I was also at Christie's, but not for quite long enough to be invited to Kuwait for the opening of the museum exhibition in 1983. All my other colleagues came back with stories of the phenomenal 3 days that surrounded it. Julian, who was there, is going to tell us more about it. My memories are principally from my colleagues and my parents. My father must have enjoyed it thoroughly, as many people told me how he'd broken out into song at the end of one evening. Sheikh Nasser was not only buying works of art. His investment office, which was at that time where Katie worked, was actively and subtly buying up shares in Christie's, which had only recently gone public. This was done under various names, but there came a time where his combined holdings reached and exceeded the limit above which you have to declare yourself, and so he became known. My first encounter with this phenomenal collector, who's also part owner of the company, was for me completely unexpected, but in hindsight, very typical. He came into the front counter, unannounced, and wanted to see what we had in the warehouse. At that time, the Islamic sales at Christie's were, to be honest, not particularly impressive, and the warehouse was relatively bare. But I remember well his coming down and taking pleasure in this relatively unassuming engraved tinned copper bowl, handling it carefully, rolling it over in his hands, and loving the intricacy of the engraving. And it was that personal touch that really made an impact on me that first time. But the love of not just the masterpiece, but also the academic fragment, I believe is something that Oliver is going to say more about. I became more aware of it when I and our consultant, the late lovely Rafe Pinder-Wilson, travelled together to Kuwait to go through the Kofler Truniger collection of Islamic art. There were, of course, masterpieces, like the piece on the left, but it was the inclusion of fragments like the other 4 items on the screen that he loved taking time off from his work to discuss with Rafe. Time and time again at auction, he would select fascinating items that were not necessarily masterpieces, but which were very rare and demonstrated features not seen elsewhere. The 2 jades on the screen are typical. The dagger handle has a later blade, but the hilt was made in the royal workshop of Shah Ismail I. The bowl on the left, albeit lacking the inlay, was one that only Sheikh Nasser recognized as being far earlier than the 17th century date it was given in the catalogue. Sheikh Nasser was a man of principle. Early in my career at Christie's, when we went to the warehouse to catalogue what had come in the previous week, this carpet that's on the screen was waiting for us. It had been consigned without any prior notification. Those were the days when business was easy. Sheikh Nasser happened to be in London just before its auction and came to the view. At that stage, he was not well known by sight, and so could overhear a group of dealers discussing this same huge Mughal Pashmina lattice carpet. They were going to buy it and cut it up. It would make many wonderful fragments. Sheikh Nasser was absolutely determined that this should not happen, and so gave Katie Marsh an unlimited budget with which to buy it. He was going to restore it, but every 10 years he found out quite how much it was going to cost and deferred the commitment. As an amusing coincidence, 2 weeks before the auction, the wreck of King Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, had been raised from the seabed amid great media excitement. Sheikh Nasser referred to this carpet as his Mary Rose. At this point, I'd also like to add that Sheikh Nasser would really have appreciated the wonderful Mughal Pashmina lattice carpet dating from Shah Jahan's reign that we have in the sale on view downstairs in the St. James's galleries. It is a really wonderful example, both historically and aesthetically, the finest Mughal carpet to have been offered on the market in decades, with fabulous drawing. It's downstairs, and don't miss it while you are here. End of commercial break. Even when Sheikh Nasser wanted to buy something, it was very rare that he was prepared to bid without limit. When the wonderful Indian enamel gold-covered cup and saucer from the collection of the 3rd Marquis of Bute came onto the market, Sheikh Nasser ended up as the underbidder, at 20 times the admittedly very low estimate, losing out to Simon Ray. Simon, however, knew that Sheikh Nasser really wanted it, and over the period of what ended up as years, Sheikh Nasser would intermittently ask Simon about it. His persistence paid off, and eventually he did end up as the buyer. On another occasion, he was very interested by this velvet, which we had estimated at £150,000. It's a very good example of an extremely rare group and had wonderful provenance, but it was in very fragile condition. Lots of clients, including Sheikh Nasser, were interested in it before the sale, but none actually bid in the room. Immediately after the sale, we had 4 separate people, all of whom really wanted to buy it. And on this occasion, we determined with all 4, each should put in sealed final bids, and we would sell it to the highest bidder for one auction increment above the next highest bid. Sheikh Nasser at this stage put in a bid that was all but double the estimate and miles above any competitor. He certainly could be competitive on occasions. And of course, this became clear when in 1997, Sheikh Saud al-Thani entered the market like a whirlwind. It was physically apparent to all of us in our first Arts of India sale. Sheikh Saud sat in the center of the auction room, bidding on most of the top lots. Sheikh Nasser's team were in the back corner of the room. The eventual selling prices became very hard to predict. And fairly quickly, Sheikh versus Sheikh was the apparent driving force behind the market, although this was a vast oversimplification of the market at the time. When it did occur, however, it resulted in prices such as that of the carved wood octagonal panel here, which made more than 100 times the estimate. When Sheikh Saud did leave the market as rapidly as he'd entered it in the middle of 2004, Sheikh Nasser is reported to have commented that now Saud was out, he too would sit out the market and wait for prices to come down. The next 2 years were indeed a bit flat, but by 2007, prices were on the rise again. 2005 and 6 had actually been a very good, if brief, opportunity to buy. Sheikh Nasser, however, was not directly excited by personal competition. He was never happier than sitting in his informal diwan area in Sukhauji's office in Mahbula, or later in Yarmouk in Kuwait, sitting with and discussing and enjoying his works of art. The excitement with which he'd produce his new purchases to astonish the lucky visitors were tangible and infectious. As time went on, his interests moved more into the field of antiquities, and I still vividly remember him almost throwing these lions at me as we sat on the sofas there, loving the shock on my face as I was encouraged to pick them up. That sense of fun never left him, and always puts a smile on my face when I think of him with his collection. Throughout this entire journey, Sheikh Nasser was accompanied by Sheikh Hussa. Undoubtedly, it was Sheikh Nasser who formed the collection, but Sheikh Hussa who's helped publicize it, ensuring a series of lectures and publications, and frequently being the public face of the collection. She's had a pivotal role in its creation and continuing development. They were a beautiful team for such a venture. And I shall now hand over to the others to talk about some of the works of art and other events that Sheikh Nasser managed to achieve in his remarkable life, starting with Sue.
In May 2001, the exhibition, The Treasury of the World, opened at the British Museum, curated by Emmanuel Keane and Salam Khouji, accompanied by this exhibition book. It's perhaps difficult now for anyone who doesn't closely follow this much less frequented path in the field of Mughal art to appreciate quite what a landmark exhibition this was. Literally nothing on this scale had been seen in a public institution before. Major museums, of course, had in their own Mughal collections perhaps a handful of objects, all very well known and often reproduced. So if you go, for instance, to the British Museum or to the Victoria and Albert Museum, you will see in their galleries a small group of important objects, but nothing on the scale of what was being seen in this exhibition. It had an astonishing 297 objects. It included gold-inlaid weapons as well as jeweled objects, arranged in 13 sections. Emmanuel Keane wrote in his introduction to the catalogue, "The formation of this collection has been one of Sheikh Nasser's most persistent preoccupations over the past quarter of a century, and it is impossible to overstate the degree to which his activity has been of a pioneering character." This was a deeply felt comment, but it wasn't remotely an exaggeration. Only a very small number of the pieces on display, like this unique enameled ring support for a spherical hooker base, had been exhibited and published before. The vast majority of the pieces were entirely unknown, and to see so many of them all in the same space was a truly remarkable event. Manuel kindly gave a small group of jewelry fanatics a sneak preview And I still vividly remember the excitement of walking into the exhibition space in the British Museum and being absolutely dazzled. The dagger that you see here had been exhibited before, but I'd never seen it. And the piece on the left, a scabbard mount, had never been published. The technical commentary on the dagger and its scabbard, written by Manuel, records that they are set with 1,685 rubies, 271 diamonds, 62 emeralds, as well as minute pieces of coloured glass, also enumerated. And I just love the idea of Manuel sitting for probably days, if not weeks, counting each stone. Similarly unknown and unpublished was a jade pencase, which as far as I know is a unique form in this material. And one bittersweet encounter for me was this set, which you've just seen, that came up on the London art market, and William described the persistence of Sheikh Nasser's attempts and successful purchase of it. I'd tried and obviously failed to acquire it for the V&A, but it was a consolation to see that it had gone to such a good home. And it's definitely a great advantage to be able to examine it next to the other enamelled objects of varying periods, also in the collection. The exhibition contained some extraordinary unmounted precious stones that had retained their original Mughal cuts, forms, and decoration, including extremely rare Mughal diamonds, of which this is one. And the detail of the V&A painting of Shah Jahan that you see next to him, Shah Jahan as a prince, shows him holding a turban jewel set with a diamond that may actually be the very same one. And I'm usually skeptical about such comparisons, but I do think here it probably is. But the stone that sent Mughal jewellery historians into absolute paroxysms of ecstasy was this one. Manuel Keane had revealed its existence in 1997 when he gave the V&A's annual Benjamin Zucker lecture in Mughal art. The 249-carat spinel carries its history on it in a series of inscriptions recording its first owner, Ulugh Beg. Its Safavid owner, Shah Abbas, who gave it to Jahangir in 1621, who then gave it, mounted in a turban jewel, to Shah Jahan. And this famous event is depicted in Shah Jahan's reign, and it's preserved in the Royal Collection's Padshah-Nama manuscript. Jahangir himself records in his memoirs receiving the gift and reproduces all the inscriptions to date, all of which are exactly those on the spinel, done in beautiful calligraphy. Jahangir even records the name of the calligrapher, Saidai Gilani, the Iranian head of the Royal Goldsmiths Department, who held the same position under Shah Jahan. So even on the basis of showing a very few objects that were in the Treasury of the World exhibition, I think it's obvious what a remarkable legacy this is. But it's not just the objects and the catalogue that are the legacy. It's just as much the ethos that suffuses the collection as an institution. Everything is permeated by the generosity of the man who formed it, and equally by that of Sheikh Hussa. Few collections are as willing to lend to other institutions to make images of the highest quality available for research without charge, and particularly to invite scholars from all over the world to work on the collection, facilitated by Chief Curator Sue Kaokji and her staff. All this surely realizes the hope of Sheikh Nasser, expressed in his foreword to a volume of papers given at the exhibition conference and published by the Society of Jewellery Historians. He wrote of his wish that the exhibition and publication will generate a wider public who reverence India's jewellery arts traditions and will result in a never-ceasing enhancement and intensification of scholarly and artistic studies in the area. And I think they really have done. Thank you.
It is me. Williams, just a little anecdote. I used to go to Kuwait now and again in the preparation of this catalogue, and one anecdote which Nasser said was that members of his family would come round to the house and say, "Oh, you poor man, you're spending too much on your art collection. You can only afford these old carpets with holes in them. Let us throw them away and we will buy you a new set of carpets for your house." My involvement with the collection started in the 1990s, first through Katie Marsh and then meeting Sheikh Nasser himself, and ended up with this catalogue. And the very cover image, I think, shows something of the scope of interest of Sheikh Nasser, that this is it was then a unique fragment of Eastern Iranian slipware showing a figural picture, which was unknown at that time, and I think shows his interest and discernment in not just odd things, but odd things which were quite important. And this was the first of something that has since grown into a much bigger field. The collection that he built is not only filled with iconic great masterpieces, the Fatimid luster bowl on the left, the Ottoman Iznik jug on the right, and things like that, but other things for which people like me were really grateful, that bringing back from hidden or forgotten collections, for instance, a whole group of Sultanabad ware, of which one is here on the left from the Kalekian collection, which hadn't been seen in decades, or things from the Bahag Degane collection, this fantastic Damascus luster jar here on the right. But masterpieces, yes. But actually, what I found interesting was the extent of the collection in other areas. Sherds, here on the right, a group of sherds from Egypt, of things which don't exist in whole pieces generally, and represent a whole area of Islamic pottery that is generally forgotten and not built into the histories which we should be writing, but don't. And the thing that is most terrifying for the museum curator, unglazed ware, which we see here on the, I love this piece on the left because of its sort of, I think it's a mistake, this splash of grays across it, this sort of modernist flourish, but it was what was the pot underneath, and trying to work out exactly what that was. I wouldn't believe everything you read in the catalogue that I wrote on the unglazed ware. Also really important and fascinating to me was a whole group of molds. And on the right, there's here of a very extensive collection of little tools made, not for making pottery, but for making molds to make molded pottery. And on the left, a master mold from which the negatives would be taken, in which the final pots would be made. And from this particular mold, there is a known pot in the David collection and one in Copenhagen. Where are you, Kel? There you are. And one in Tehran. This is already a second generation master, and it opens up a whole new perspective on mold making as a separate skill from potting, and what it means about provenance, distribution, attribution, and so forth. And Sheikh Nasser didn't just allow us, but was actually positively keen for us to look into the dodgy bits in his collection. And as in any collection of any ambition, there are dodgy bits. I mean, Islamic pottery is full of dodgy bits. This was one of his pride and joys, a very rare lacquerby dish published by Pesar in 1920, a Syrian 12th century. And when Kirsty Norman, who was employed as conservator there at that time, started looking into it, it became more and more complex. And the more we got into it, the more complex it became. And we had to say to him, look, if we go any further with this, we're not going to put it back again like it was. And he said, no, carry on. And it ended up with this object, which consists of over 200 sherds, of which every sherd is either belongs to the front bit, the front of the plate. Thank you. So on the left are the sherds from the front of the plate, on the right are the sherds from the back of the plate. They're all genuine, they all belong to the 12th century Syria, but they don't belong together. and they were patched together, glued together, and made up into this dish. Sheikh Nasser not only was interested in following this, but in publishing it. And I have to say that the chapter in that book by Kirstie Norman is the most important chapter in the book. And long after my historical speculations have become outdated, I think that will be something that goes on. It's full of, everyone should read it, it's full of the dangers you have to look out for when dealing with particularly early Islamic pottery. This is a very modest slide. It just shows the imprint on the book. It was published in 2004. And behind this, there are a number of things that I'd like to say. One is 2004 was 10 years at least after I had been invited to start writing the book. No idea of a deadline, no pressure, just take your time. The collection evolved, the catalogue evolved, we discussed things, and eventually it came to fruition. More than 10 years, and I believe I'm not even, the longest author in producing a text at that time. And that is a sign of a truly great patron dealing with such a publication. The other thing was Manuel Keane apparently had said to Sheikh Nasser, and he took up this suggestion. He said, this book absolutely has to be A4 format. Why? So it's easy for students to Xerox. Not only was that actually adopted, but the book was published, the paperback cost under £25 in 2004 for a book of over 500 pages with 600 colour illustrations in it. It was an unheard of price and meant that it could become a handbook for every student. It wasn't a vanity publishing, it was something of real, I hope, at least in the illustrations and Kirstie Norman, of real use to students, and will carry on. Finally, I found it very interesting that in his preface to the catalogue, he didn't boast of the wonderful masterpieces that he'd acquired or the great rarities. He chose this piece, a rather, first sight, modest bit of Iranian inscribed earthenware of what, the 12th or early 13th century. And he says, and I quote here, that he drew a great deal of satisfaction from pieces that were neither courtly nor costly, as exemplified here. And he said of this, that the freedom and sureness of draftsmanship and design would do credit to Picasso. And I think it does as much credit to Sheikh Nasser himself in his discerning eye, his keen interest, which means for me that his collection will be keenly interesting, is keenly interesting now, and will be keenly interesting for years, for generations to come. Thank you.
There are many reasons to celebrate Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah's achievement as a patron of art and culture. I am very grateful for this opportunity to talk about his latest contribution. Through the Dar al-Asar al-Islamiyya, Sheikh Nasser, together with Sheikh Hussa, have established a forum for Islamic art of global dimensions. The Al-Sabah collection is the first of its kind in the Gulf, has been a groundbreaking initiative also seen in the Arab world. Since the opening of the museum in 1983, and in spite of the destruction and looting it has suffered in 1990, its exhibitions and loot, and in many parts of the world, the series of publications and research, excavation projects have promoted Islamic art and its scholarship. Other collections, private and public, have followed. An interest for the Islamic artistic heritage has taken a shape in the Arab world that I would describe like a movement. When I was invited to write a catalogue of metalwork from the Western Islamic world in the Al-Sabah collection, I was, of course, honored to participate to the activities of Dar al-Asar and at the same time to join the company of distinguished scholars whose publications on the collection are a must-reading, or were a must-reading in my courses. It has been also a most rewarding experience to compile or to do this work, thanks to the wonderful working atmosphere I encountered at the Dar al-Asar and the efficiency and kindness of the Al-Sabah team, who made my work a true pleasure. The writer of a catalogue is obviously a co-author who shares the authorship with the collector who has created and designed the collection. I had already heard about the fabulous personality of Sheikh Nasser, and I found it not the least exaggerated. He was indeed the very special person with great charm and modesty, erudition, and deep thinking I had heard of. As a collector, he showed a youthful enthusiasm about his discoveries and acquisition, and he enjoyed sharing his experiences. I was interested by the breadth of the collection I had to catalogue, which includes pieces of major and minor significance. And I was very interested by what Oliver was saying, the interest for the major pieces and the minor pieces at the same time. And also, besides to see, it covered a large period of time from late antiquity to the late 19th century, thus giving a panoramic perspectives in terms of chronology. But I was particularly excited to see that besides the pieces or the artifacts that bearing illustrious historical names, the collection also included some unpretentious vernacular items. Although these pieces would not be eligible to figure on the cover of art books, they were particularly interesting for me for the poetical inscriptions that have not been read before and that I have been trying to work on for the last 20 years. At the same time, at that time, the pièce de résistance, the crowning piece of the collection, which is depicted on the catalogue, had not come to light yet. When this year arrived, Sheikh Nasser invited me with other colleagues to look at it. It had come on the market together with a remarkable tray that is now in the Al-Thani collection. Both, at that time, were heavily covered with thick rust, as you can see, so that apart from the surprising amount of silver inlay, not much was recognizable. In fact, after the first cleaning, I began working on the UN to write my entry, but when the piece was finally cleaned, I had to make important changes in my entry because it looks different after it was completely cleaned. The Al-Sabah ewer is unique in multiple respects. Its inscription along the shoulder is the earliest of its kind on an Islamic vessel. It carries the date 122 of the Hijrah, which is 740, and attributes the ewer to a patron called Muslim ibn Qutbihan, but who had made it in the city of Baalbek for the Umayyad Caliph Hisham, in Baalbek, which is in today Lebanon, of course. The Caliph Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik ruled between 724 and 743. Here are the inscriptions. Although metal vessels inlaid with other metals are known from antiquity and late antiquity, the intensive use of silver and copper here on this object is unparalleled at that period as far as we can tell. No object with such dense silver and copper inlay are known to have been produced until the 12th century. The Sabah ewer incorporates features of early Umayyad architectural decoration, and here I have to change, features of early Umayyad architecture decoration. However, it is, and also geometric patterns. However, it takes the geometric style further from the six-pointed to the more complex and more widely used in Islamic art later, the eight-pointed star. Its shape goes back, it has a shape that goes back to Byzantine tradition, as one can tell from this object, and there are quite numerous of them in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So it is akin to this. And interestingly, it's also, the shape continues somehow further in Syria as this ewer or vase, the so-called Barberini vase, produced in the 12th century shows. The combination of inscription with geometric and stylized symmetrical motifs identified the ewer with Islamic aesthetics, in particular, when compared to the so-called Marwan ewer associated with the last Umayyad Caliph Marwan II and attributed to the same period, excavated in Egypt. As a work of art, the Al-Sabah ewer is an extraordinary piece, and it compels us to amend our historiography of Islamic material culture, and it will surely also entail new research on the history of metalwork. Sheikh Nasser's acquisition of the only vessel known to bear the name of an Umayyad Caliph is a most felicitous contribution to the history of Islamic art. And I feel very much with Sheikh Hussa the sadness that he didn't see it published or enjoy its reception in the world of art. However, the name Al-Sabah will continue to glow with the name of Hisham in the history of Arab princely patronage of art. Thank you.
"1983 was a stellar year for Islamic art on the Bosphorus and on the Gulf. 1983 saw a panoply of exhibitions in Istanbul under the rubric Anatolian Civilizations. And in the autumn of that year, Poland, Austria, and Germany held a huge number of exhibitions relating to the siege of Vienna in particular, and European relations with the Ottomans in general. But the year began with the most remarkable event. That was the opening of the National Museum of Kuwait and, of course, the unveiling of the Al-Sabah collection. And it's that revelatory moment that we celebrate now. I mentioned the other events for two reasons. First, the exhibitions in Turkey were almost entirely drawn from public collections. I remember sitting with my great friend in Salugel on a low wall just outside Ayasofya Jami, talking about how the exhibitions had actually created a surge of interest in the Ottoman period and a surge in collecting. There were, of course, pioneers in Turkey, and the Sudberg Hanım Museum had actually opened in 1980. But its scope was really Anatolian and Ottoman. In terms of a private collection that was comprehensive, chronologically and geographically, in the way it looked at the arts of Islam, the Al-Sabah collection was a pioneer, not just in the Middle East, but anywhere. The second reason for mentioning the other events was to remind you of the turmoil in other parts of the world. I think some of us here can remember the exhibitions and conferences in Poland when there was literally nothing in the shops. I remember one shop opposite the hotel where the only thing they sold were brown carrots. And they weren't heritage carrots. So our Turkish colleagues came en masse in several coaches, accompanied by chefs. The hold of one of the coaches was full of edibles: aubergines, tomatoes, peppers, sumac, you name it. Everything you could not get in Poland at the time. Everything that allowed the Turks to host wonderful banquets. Believe me, there was no such shortage in Kuwait. For Kuwait, at the opening of this exhibition, seemed a world oblivious of the chaos elsewhere. Though sadly, that was to be shattered a decade later with the invasion of Kuwait. So let me begin with my memories of that Kuwait journey. On the 22nd of February, arriving at Heathrow and finding a whole host of colleagues and friends from the world of Islamic art in the UK. They kept coming, as if drawn by a Pied Piper. I remember the sense of excitement. This was no ordinary museum opening. What munificence that so many people were invited. And the first evening we were all invited to a banquet in one of the 5 buildings of the Kuwait National Museum. The buildings didn't look quite as unloved then as they do in this photograph, but there was the imprint of the rather charmless modernism of the architect Michel Ecochard, in a building started only in 1981. But next morning we gathered for the opening and we waited for some time in the courtyard as young ladies brought round dates and incense. Now I remember the wait was rather long as we needed the dignitaries to make their tour. But for me the time passed quickly as I recall falling into deep conversation with our next speaker, Suren Melikian. Sadly though, Suren, I can't remember a word of what we talked about, just that it was intense and fraternal. And then we entered. And I'm sure I speak here for everyone. We were astounded. This was a huge display over many rooms of some 1,000 objects. It aimed at covering every period, every place. But at no point was the desire for inclusion allowed to compromise quality. Now, Sheikh Nasser only began collecting, I'm told, in 1973. Perhaps his first purchase wasn't that auspicious. His first acquisition, so Katie tells me, was an Iranian figurative carpet depicting Cyrus the Great. And Jassim Homezi kindly took him aside and said, "Let me show you what a real carpet looks like." But after that, Sheikh Nasser never looked back. Now, the remarkable thing here is that Sheikh Nasser was only asked to contribute to the National Museum in June of 1982, leaving a mere 8 months to do everything, including a catalogue. Yet nothing betrayed the haste. Of course, Sheikh Nasser had a battalion up all night, including Katie, polishing the cases, and there were the odd glitches. The alarms in the cases had been placed on such a sensitive setting that when the Emir was given his royal tour, the alarm in every case was set off by the plentiful gold on his robes and his person. It was an unintended chorus of alarms. Now, going into the galleries, I was immediately struck by the structure, the arrangement of the rooms. They recalled the Met Galleries that had opened in 1971, where Richard Ettinghausen had in turn been influenced by the structure of the galleries in Berlin. They were early centuries, quite dense in display of cases and objects. I'm sorry that I only have a few slides. And then the later rooms, if you like, the gunpowder empires, opened up into capacious rooms where greater use was made of the walls. There were other echoes of the Met display. In almost every room, there were objects of great size, many architectural. While in later rooms, the walls had not only architectural items, but were festooned with great carpets, creating a sense of grandeur against which the objects were set. And in the cases, there was an echo of the Met displays with objects on multiple levels. And there were wonderful juxtapositions where the combination of objects was greater than the sum of its parts. I remember particularly well a Fatimid luster fragment next to a fragment of an unglazed jar, next to an intact luster jar. Here, exactly as Ollie has just told us, was a collector who was clearly not put off by the fragmentary nature of an object, but who could see in its partial state its poignant beauty. The juxtapositions encourage us to look long, and the extraordinary view as one came off one of those strange raised walkways that Echo Shah liked, as one moved between the pavilions onto a gallery area and looked down at the gigantic Moroccan 14th century doors that were so sadly torched during the invasion of Kuwait. This was theatre. And then, of course, there was the monumental garden carpet. So there were single objects that encouraged us to look long. Many of these features then reminded me of the Met displays and even of the juxtapositions that you saw in the LA Maya Museum in Jerusalem, again, where Richard Ettinghausen's hand was deeply felt. This wasn't an illusion, for there was a Met and Ettinghausen connection through Lynn Jenkins and Manuel Keane. However, let's be clear, I am not citing these Met connections in any condescending way. Remember that this was before most of the major collections of Islamic art had gone for redisplays. So here we were faced with a compendious collection structured in a tested manner with a sense of historical vista. All of it touched with lightness and with an eye for the interesting. And what a collection. It's utterly astonishing that it had been formed in only 10 years. An astounding feat from that Cyrus the Great carpet to what we saw here. And as we went round, there was a sense, as one viewed masterpiece after masterpiece, of seeing some familiar friends, even if one didn't always recall where you knew them from. So take the Hunt Oliphant on the left. Yes, it had been published by Kuhnel in 1971, but my goodness, was it wonderful to see it. Now, many objects like this Oliphant were acquired singly, but Sheikh Nasser negotiated a major coup. The collection of Martine Marie-Paul de Béarn, Comtesse de Béarn, who died in 1939, a famously eccentric lady who was a remarkable collector across almost every field. Just look at the collections in the Getty, for example. Her remarkable Titian, or perhaps the most striking of all Greek vases. So we saw here objects maybe familiar to you from Gaston Migeon's Manuel d'Art Musulman, the rock crystal chess pieces, or the Spanish ivories. There were other less well-published items from the Comtesse de Béarn's collection, almost 100 of them. So here was a collection that was at the forefront of the display of Islamic art and that was encyclopedic, replete with masterpieces, animated by intriguing fragments. We were all excited at being privileged to be among the first to see the collection's breadth and brilliance. The we included scholars, and it's interesting that there is not a single picture of a scholar, dealers, eminent dealers, collectors, and of course, Maharajas. This was a hubbub of hobnobs. But it's interesting to see not just the glamour, but the wonderful relationship here between Sheikh Nasser and Babchi. I wasn't the only one excited, and one day was for the opening, as I just described. But the next day, many of us were let into the museum, and I recall at least one impromptu seminar. I sort of lingered behind, but then came into the Mogul room to see Robert Skelton, surrounded by scholars as he discussed the Mogul seated scribe, which he'd had taken out of the case. I can think of no greater testimony to the collection than to have a gaggle of experts hanging on Robert's words and arguing over the finer points of just one out of 1,000 works of art. Sheikh Nasser, Sheikh Hussa, I can't praise you enough for your achievement. Thank you.
I'm going to be very brief and just say that among the affinities that give rise to friendship, one of the most compelling is a shared passion for objects. Sheikh Nasser was irresistibly attracted to objets d'art, and so am I, to the frequent irritation of my nearest and dearest. It is through this powerful bond created by the love of objects that I came to know Sheikh Nasser. He responded intensely to the beauty of masterpieces such as this extraordinary Iranian candlestick, if I could have it on the screen, made around 1200, 1210 of the Common Era, probably in Herat. But as three of my predecessors have underlined, he also responded to very modest pieces, and this is perhaps a far rarer gift, probably the truest mark of a deep understanding of art. When Sheikh Nasser came across pieces like this half of a spherical incense burner, which I hope is on the screen, which would be called in Arabic a shammama, from the same period as the marvelous candlestick, he saw in his mind the glory it once had. He could visualize the faces at one time intact that the characters representing the 12 signs of the zodiac originally had. Like all people with a deeply ingrained love of objects, Sheikh Nasser was not given to discoursing about the art. He preferred to look, and look he did with a sharpness perhaps inherited from his ancestors roaming through the harsh deserts of Arabia and trained to be attentive to the slightest change in the environment. That sharpness went together with a genuine, exceedingly rare modesty, which do not find often among highly successful art collectors. I would say you never find it among them. It led him to conceal this sharpness, which allowed him to make some stunning coups. Perhaps the most sensational of all was the discovery of a Chinese blue and white dish of the 15th century, which I hope you have on the screen. It had been admired in the distant past. The Mughal emperor, Alamgir, had his ownership mark drilled on the back. Alamgir Shahi, and you have the date in Arabic digits, 1071, corresponding to September 1660 to August 1661, in the third year of his reign. Was it the obvious beauty of the Chinese dish that attracted his attention, or did Sheikh Nasser, that highly cultivated man, ever fascinated by history, respond to the important inscription? We won't know because he never spoke about himself. But he certainly did not hesitate in the modest shop where the dish was offered amidst junk, despite a price set, I am told, at just a few dozen dollars, which could well have aroused suspicion about authenticity. For while Sheikh Nasser clearly had ample means at his disposal, it should never be forgotten that it was ultimately his eye that allowed him to make extraordinary acquisitions. He did not just see the objects as beautiful pieces, which they were. He recognized them as expressions of cultures. His mind, which was molded by the classics of Arabic literature, probably fostered the love of calligraphy that he had and that he admired on some of them. This calligraphy on many of the objects conveys concepts that were shared by the otherwise highly diverse civilizations of the Islamic world. They're often dismissed in the West as well-wishing inscriptions, which is probably one of the most idiotic way of characterizing them. They convey concepts which are metaphysical, many of them mystical, many of them Sufi, with notions such as, to begin with, baraka, which doesn't mean luck, which means divine grace, such as karama, which is a generosity shown by God to man, such as al-fana wal-baqa, annihilation, and duration, which is a complex Sufi concept on which I'm not qualified to speak, and I won't bore you with that. If I may, I would just like to add one word about Sheikh Nasser. I did not try to portray a man who was extremely complex and extremely subtle. Some of you will be aware that was a profoundly religious man, which hasn't been mentioned, but he didn't discuss religion. True believers rarely discuss religion. It was too essential for him to turn it into a conversation topic. On the other hand, he was anything but a man austere by temperament. He had immense joie de vivre, as the French would say, a zest for life. He was always ready for a laugh and had a very keen sense of humor. More dangerously for others, he was a sharp reader of character, and he sized up those who approached him in the split fraction of a minute, which was not always very comfortable when you realized it. But he was also fundamentally kind, which is rare when people are sharp. He was generous of spirit. He hated injustice, zulm, oppression, jafa. All that revolted him. He would have been a very great reformer. Kuwait lost a great man, and I lost a friend. At my age, there aren't many of them left. Thank you very much.
On behalf of Sheikh Nasser al-Sabah and her family, I would like to express very grateful thanks to Christie's for so generously hosting this event. Special thanks also to our distinguished speakers who have graced the platform with their individual memories of Sheikh Nasser and his collection. I would also like to thank the wonderful musicians who agreed to play for us in spite of the fact that tonight is Diwali and they should have been with their families. I have recently been thinking about the night before the opening of the museum in 1983. Sheikh Nasser and I were driving from the final installations at the museum to meet the guests who had just arrived from overseas, some of whom are here this evening. And he remarked that he was very happy to have been able to achieve the museum in the first half of his life. Sheikh Nasser was then just short of his 35th birthday, and tragically, his own lifespan forecast proved only too accurate. But his achievements in the next 35 years are even more remarkable.
Quite apart from his political and diplomatic activities, he managed to increase the Islamic collection many-fold, sponsored major exhibitions which traveled to dozens of destinations worldwide, lent groups of objects to a large number of international exhibitions, and granted a long-term loan of several hundred objects to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Over time, he had an ever-growing interest in the ancient cultures of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and even beyond, from the 3rd millennium BC to the advent of Islam. And his collection now includes almost 5,000 ancient objects. Together, they help the understanding and appreciation of the religious, political, social, and technical aspects of the civilizations that once dominated the ancient world in these areas. Once the collections had reached a substantial corpus, Sheikh Nasser made a decision to publish high-quality catalogues of each media. And as Oliver Watson has already said, he was very happy to subsidize this endeavor so that our books will be generally affordable. The first volume, Islamic Glass, was published by Thames and Hudson in 2001, and 11 further volumes across all media have followed. These volumes are displayed in the main reception area and can be purchased from the Thames and Hudson representative. Further volumes on Mughal jewelry, Islamic jewelry, Tiraz textiles, Qurans, tiles and architectural elements, jades, metalwork of the Persianate world, ancient South Arabia, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and ancient jewelry are all in process. Our first ebook, a Hindi version of the Treasure of the World exhibition catalogue, will shortly be available for the Indian market. I leave you with this image on the screen where you see Sheikh Nasser enjoying one of his favorite occupations, leafing through auction catalogues and flagging objects of interest. Happily, in this instance, that's a Christie's catalogue. I thank you for attending and I wish you an exciting week in the sale room.